If you've ever had the opportunity to be in some big budget LA studio, you've definitely heard some engineer or some hipster or somebody talking about, oh my God, they have a 2324 Neve API SSL Yamaha board. The preamps are so crazy. So let's go check that shit out on Sweetwater and see what kind of prices we have. $2,000 for one channel. Yeah, one. So rewind, what do these actually do, and do you need one, and can you feel justified and better than everyone else for not actually buying one? A preamp is a voltage amplifier for amplifying a low-level input signal. Its output is the output to a higher-level amplifier. So, long story short, this just makes quiet signals louder. So in case you're wondering, inside every interface, yes, even little cheap-ass ones, you have a preamp. This volume knob right here that turns signals up is a preamplifier. This pre-amplifies the signal before you record it. Wait, so I literally already own this. Do these expensive-ass preamps actually do something different? Well, yeah, no. The real answer to this stuff is that preamps add magic. And when I say preamps, I mean these expensive ass preamps. What makes a Neve, an API, any of these things, they add something that is more than just turning a volume knob up. Because functionally what this does is literally just turning the same WAV file that gets recorded inside your DAW. Because this is not trying to change the sound, this is just trying to make it louder. And that's the biggest difference between these preamps that cost a whole lot of money, have a bunch of name brands, is that they're actually meant to change the sound. Not just turn it up, not just do something practical, they're meant to actually alter the sound in a pleasing way. Okay, so like what kind of changes are they actually making though? Is it like EQ or compression or like what? And so this is where the magic comes in. And so each brand of preamp kind of does its own thing. So instead of thinking about like, hey, there's these 6 parameters and each of the different preamps changes these parameters in 6 different ways, it's more that each preamp changes different parameters in different ways. So Neves are usually described as warm and thick and have a lot of glue, meaning that there's some compression that's happening in this, there's some saturation that's happening, and typically the EQ kind of darkens it a little bit. That's a lot of different little magical things that are happening. You don't have to turn any knobs, just running the signal through a Neve does certain things to this that are kind of unique to just what Neves do. While an SSL is typically described as more edgier and clear, it has a little more clarity and a bit harsher often. So that's altering the EQ curve and adding its own flavor of something, but that's not the same level of parameters that the Neves doing. On top of that, you take something like an API, these are famous for their transients, in the sense they like handle super spitty, aggressive, transient, punchy things, typically better than a Neve does. So especially if you come from the world of VSTs where you're expecting things to do, hey, this is an EQ and it does EQ stuff, this is a compressor, it does compressor stuff. Think of each of these different preamps as its own tiny multi-effects unit, meaning that it's doing a couple of different things all at once, and each of these different preamps is doing different things. But let's be clear, it's not OMG, it's so different. If you were to sit down and do a shootout through all these different preamps, you could hear the marginal differences that were there, but it's nothing close to night and day, like turning on a reverb or something like that. Hey, but like, almost everything I do is already in the DAW. Will a preamp benefit me? Like, should I output all my sounds to a preamp and then record them again to get this magic? No, you shouldn't do that. I mean, you could, but it almost certainly wouldn't be worth it. You see, preamps are almost universally used at the tracking, meaning a keyboard or mic or any kind of physical signal, we want to impart that preamp's changes before it's actually recorded. Why though? The simple answer is that it just sounds better. We've been going through this for a while and we found that going through tracking preamps makes a fairly noticeable difference once we start stacking this. So if I record one channel through a preamp, it's not gonna be night or day, but if I record a whole band, I record 30 to 60 tracks through this preamp, that's when it starts actually making a fairly profound difference and really enhancing the sound. And simultaneously, you really don't see an engineer taking a VST or a actually recorded signal, sending it back out just to go through and get the color of a preamp. It's really not worth the hassle. It happens occasionally, and it can be used for experimental things, but as far as a typical approach, it's really not that common. As opposed to tracking, basically universally, everybody recommends going through a preamp to actually track that. So if you're someone who makes purely electronic music, meaning that you're just in software, you're kind of off the hook for buying a preamp. So yes, you can continue to save your money and not spend it on software that you fucking stole, you fucking pirate. So, but let's say you record a few things, like a vocal or a guitar, or physical synthesizers because you're cooler and better than everybody else. A preamp is something actually worth considering for this one reason. hardware compression. For some goddamn reason, going straight from the signal to a preamp into a hardware compressor is something that we haven't really figured out in software yet. It just sounds good in a way that we haven't quite replicated, and it's fairly noticeable. Again, this is not night and day. But as opposed to a lot of famous mixers, after the tracking stage, they just work without a console. There's a lot of famous mixers to the point completely inside Pro Tools, completely inside their software, without using any physical hardware, except at the tracking stage. We are still using preamps and hardware compression. But to use hardware compression, you have to have a preamp, because these compressors are expecting a certain level of signal that the original source signal can't give it. And this preamp will boost it up to the input that the hardware compression is actually expecting. And let's be clear, hardware is expensive, compressors are expensive, preamps are expensive. All this shit is expensive, but it's not quite as bad as you might expect. So the question that no one is answering, what should you buy? I'm a huge fan of GuitarCenter.com's used section, especially for something like a preamp. Preamps are pretty tough in the sense that they're just meant to sit in a rack. It's not like they're being taken on the road or thrown in and out of a case or getting stepped on or beer poured on. Generally aren't really getting beat up like a synthesizer or a guitar or pedals. So they're pretty good things to buy used. So for your first preamp, I really recommend going something colored, meaning something that actually affects the sound and changes the sound in kind of a noticeable way. Because you already have a pretty clean preamp inside your interface. This guy's job is not to impart any of its own characteristics on it. It's meant to make things louder. You want a preamp that actually changes something. So I'm a big fan of the Golden Age 73 series. They're pretty cheap. You can find them brand new. I think all of them are under $350 new. I got this one for less than $200. Most of them emulate some variation of the Neve 1073, which has the Neve sound. And these are called clones, meaning they're trying to make a cheaper alternative to these really expensive pieces of gear. And it does an okay job, does a pretty good job. Is it exactly a Neve 1073? No. Does it sound good? Yes. And that's what we're shooting for. And it's a great way to start playing around with preamps. And again, this is not night and day, but this is, yeah, that makes it sound a little bit better, I guess. That's what we're shooting for. So lately my hardware keyboard setup has been I take the synth, go into whatever pedals I'm running at the time, into some hardware compression. With all of that together, I really do notice a difference and a lot of sounds that are pretty sterile. And on top of that, it's a lot more fun to play with because I have physical things that I can just hop over and start hitting keyboards and start turning knobs. Instead of messing around with software, it's a lot more fun to play with these things. And I can get a sound that's pretty good right off the bat. I don't have to run nearly as many changes in software now because I'm getting a better sound at the source. And really I found with like Arranger keyboards, which have a lot of presets and they're very normal, boring, I consider kind of lifeless, generic sounds. I find when you run them through these setups, especially through a preamp where you run it just a little bit too hard, it really makes these sounds that I find pretty boring and stale to have some life in them. And just like everything, preamps have hysteria around with people going, oh my God, you have to use an API board with haba preamps. And they're stupid. You can make amazing art on just $100 interface at this point. Literally, the converters and a Focusrite Scarlett, the bottom of the line interface, are leaps and bounds beyond what things were even 10 years ago. And it's super cheap, super affordable. And preamps are just one more little tool that can help with this. They're not gonna overhaul your process, but they can add a little magic. And anything that makes this process easier is something that you should look into. So, I'm BABYWOLF. Go make some badass art. Get out of here.